There is a small limestone figure in a museum in Vienna, small enough to close your hand around. It has no face. The top of its head is covered in tight, careful rows. 7 bands, by most counts, spiraling out from a point at the crown and continuing down over the place where her eyes should be. Somebody made that pattern deliberately. Which leaves a question I can't shake. If Ice Age people wore their hair in patterns, then someone sat still for a long time, and someone else stood behind them, working. The figure is the Venus of Willendorf. A workman named Johann Veran dug her out of a railway cutting above the Danube in August 1908, supervised by the archaeologist Josef Sambathi. She is about 11 centimeters tall, carved from a limestone that isn't local to the site, and roughly 30,000 years old. Deep Ice Age. Mammoth country. Her body is carved with real attention. Knees, belly, thin bracelets on both forearms. Then the head. No eyes, no mouth. Just rows of small raised bumps wrapping the whole skull. The old reading, still the common one, is braids. Tight coiled rows worked close to the scalp, running front to back, the way cornrows sit. If that's right, it tells you something immediately. Nobody has ever put that pattern into their own hair. Coiled rows need a second person, working from behind, for hours. But in the year 2000, 3 researchers published a paper arguing the whole reading was wrong. The thing on her head, they said, isn't hair at all. It's a hat. Olga Soffer, James Adovasio, and David Hyland, writing in Current Anthropology. Adovasio is a specialist in ancient basketry. He looks at old objects and sees weaving structure. Their point? The rows don't behave like braids. They begin at a single center point on the crown and spiral outward, the way a coiled basket is built up. And crucially, the pattern runs straight down over the face. Hair does not grow forward over your eyes in a continuous sheet. A cap pulled low does exactly that. They had reason to think in fiber. 4 years earlier, the same team identified impressions of woven textile and cord pressed into fired clay at Dolní Věstonice and Pavlov in Moravia. Those impressions are around 26,000 years old. Plaiting, twining, basketry weaves, netting fine enough to catch hairs. Ice Age Europe had string and knew what to do with it. So the cap is not a fantasy. But not everyone accepts it. Randall White, who has spent decades on Gravettian ivory work, warns against reading these carvings as photographs. They're conventions. A carver working ivory with a flint point is compressing a whole person into shorthand. And shorthand can be ambiguous without meaning to be. Which is where a second figure helps, because she has a face, and the pattern on her head stops in a place that means something. She was found in 1894 at the Grotte du Pape, near Brassempouy in the Landes in southwest France, by Edouard Piet. Mammoth ivory, under 4 centimeters tall. She has a brow, a long straight nose, the hollows of eyes, no mouth. She is one of the earliest realistic human faces we have, around 25,000 years old. Over her scalp and down the back of her neck runs a grid. Vertical lines crossed by horizontals, cut with a fine point into the ivory. The French call her La Dame à la Capuche, the lady with the hood. That name is already an argument, and it might be the wrong one, because the grid ends in a clean, straight line across the forehead. A hood has a hem, but so does a fringe, cut level with a blade. Here's where I'll say what I actually think. For Willendorf, the cap reading convinces me. The pattern covering the whole face is very hard to explain as hair. For Brassempouy, I lean the other way. The grid follows the curve of the skull too closely, and it stops where a haircut stops, not where cloth would fall. But notice what happens either way. A woven cap means spinning fiber and working it for hours. A cut fringe means a blade held steady against somebody's forehead. So what were they cutting with? Here, the evidence thins out badly, because hair almost never survives. From Upper Paleolithic Europe, we have essentially no human head hair at all. No preserved braid, no hair in a burial you can measure. We work backwards from tools, and from what a stone edge physically does to a strand of keratin. A freshly struck flint blade is extraordinarily sharp. The edge is a fresh fracture, in places finer than a steel razor. Gravettian sites are full of them, struck and discarded within minutes. But a blade cuts differently from scissors. Scissors shear a hair square across. A drawn blade leaves a long, slanted bevel. And it needs tension. The hair has to be pulled taut first. Which means, again, hands. You cannot pull your own fringe taut and cut a level line across your own forehead with a flake of stone. Someone does it for you. And before you can cut hair straight, you have to get it straight. Which raises the strangest gap in all of this. We have no securely identified comb from the Ice Age. Not one. That isn't a skill problem. These people carved eyed sewing needles. The earliest come from Siberian sites around 40,000 years ago, plus beads, awls, and faces like Brasempui. Cutting a row of teeth into a strip of antler is easier than carving a human face. They could have made combs. So why don't we find them? The honest answer is that we don't know. But there are 3 decent possibilities, and I find one of them a good deal more likely than the others. The first is preservation. A wooden comb from 30,000 years ago would essentially never survive in European soil. Organic wood from this period is almost entirely gone. The second is misidentification. A broken tooth strip of bone in a museum drawer might sit catalogued as a pendant or a decorated fragment and never be questioned. The third is that they mostly used fingers. And for tightly coiled styles, that isn't a poor substitute. It's still what most of that work is done with today. I lean toward wood, plus fingers, which means the tool we're missing is the one thing that never fossilizes. Another person's hands, giving up an afternoon. Ethnography is consistent on the cost. Across many societies, elaborate hair takes half a day or longer, and it is almost never solitary work. It's done in pairs or in groups, talking. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar built a whole theory on that. In Monkeys and Apes, grooming is the glue that holds groups together, and he argued human conversation grew out of it. There was practical pressure too. Head lice have traveled with us throughout our evolution. Genetic work by Ralph Kittler and Mark Stoneking in 2003 even used lice to date the origin of clothing. In a cold, crowded shelter, hair is a problem to manage. Tangles, parasites, grease. So the figurines aren't really about fashion. They're about hours somebody chose to spend on you. Let me be clear about what's solid. The rows on Willendorf are real and deliberate. That much we can see. That they represent a woven cap is a strong argument, not a settled fact. That somebody else did the work is an inference from how hair physically behaves. Who they were, mother, sister, elder, specialist, is completely beyond the evidence. So the next time someone stands behind you, with your hair in their hands, that posture is at least 30,000 years old. Somebody in the Wachau Valley spent an afternoon doing it, and somebody else thought it was worth carving into stone.